Hi, it's awesome to be with you tonight to talk about my research on diversity, social issues, and human resources. And I'm going to talk to you tonight specifically about diversity hats. I want to encourage you to get one. I want to encourage you to observe diversity in the world around you. And I want to encourage you to work for change. Okay, so many people have ideas about what diversity is. I like to use the research-based definition of diversity called real or perceived differences that affect people's relationships, interactions, opportunities, and outcomes. And these areas of difference are often things like race, like sex, like age, disability status, or other identity-based areas. Now, you may have noticed that I use quotation marks when I said race. I did that because race is socially constructed. Even though it's socially constructed, however, it has very real meaning for people's opportunities and outcomes. Now, race is a surface level characteristic. By that I mean you can tell from a few yards, from several yards, what race a person is. And once you determine what race a person is, it's used for decision making about that person, oftentimes with very real consequences. For example, if a person is seeking a job at a restaurant, their race might be used to determine should they get a front of the house job or should they get a back of the house job, or should they even get a job at all. Some of you may remember the article by Bertrand and Malaya Nathan. It hit the press and it was quite talked about a whole lot, that looked at whether somebody has a black sounding name like Lakeisha or Jamal, or a name that's more often associated with white people like Emily or Brad. And these researchers sent out resumes to real jobs that people were trying to fill. And what they found, very troubling information they found, was that if you had a black sounding name, you had to send out 50% more resumes just to get a positive response from an employer than if you had a white sounding name. And also quite troubling, they found that just having a white sounding name was as effective as adding an additional 8 years of experience to a person with the black name to their resume. And you can see how that kind of thing would prolong your unemployment and perhaps increase the unemployment rates for black people. So what about Jorge, or George, using the English version of Jorge? How would Jorge fare? Well, actually, researchers have looked at black names and black people, Latinos and Asians, and white-sounding names and actual people with similar qualifications, similar performance, and found that they have very dissimilar work-related experiences and outcomes. And these researchers have looked at, as I've said, various races and ethnicities, and they've looked at incoming to the organization and things like layoffs, finding that whites are least likely to be laid off, followed to some extent by Asians, and then blacks being most likely to be laid off. Okay, so what about sex as a surface level characteristic? Sex is often used the same way that race is. If you're applying for a job in a restaurant, would this person get a front of the house job, or would this person get a back of the house job? If this person is looking for a low-skilled job perhaps at a hotel, one might use their sex to determine, does this person get a housekeeping job, or does this person get a valet job? And you can really clearly see how the wage gap is affected by things like that. A housekeeper cleans a lot of toilets, gets no tips. A valet gets a lot of tips. And I want to encourage you to remember to tip your housekeeper in a hotel, and also to think about why this housekeeper has to be a housekeeper. If she can push a heavy vacuum, she can easily pull a piece of luggage just like a man could do. It's not related to strength at all. It's related to something called the way we think about men and women. We think about them very, very differently. And one of the reasons we think about men and women so differently, it's ingrained in us. So you may remember being a child and hearing your elementary school teacher say, "Good morning, boys and girls." Or she might have said, "Let's speak in our quiet voice, our inside voices, boys and girls." And we think nothing of it. But if the teacher said, "Good morning, blacks, whites, Asians, and Latinos," we would actually think she had lost her mind. We would think she'd lost her mind. But we think nothing of her saying, "Good morning, boys and girls," and we see this as normal. And we see it as so normal that you didn't even notice when I said "she" as the teacher, because that's normal too. It's normal for us to expect that teachers, elementary school teachers for sure, and kindergarten teachers are women, and we don't even observe that. Well, why is that? Something called gender role socialization. And this is the process by which social institutions, such as the media, our parents, our families, and friends, tell us what's appropriate for girls. I'm losing my mic. It starts really, really early, as far as even with the toys that children are given when they're young. Girls are given dolls, boys are given trucks. Lo and behold, girls wind up to be nursery school, kindergarten teachers. Boys wind up to be truck drivers, firefighters, and engineers. Gender role socialization is very, very powerful and very, very real, has very, very real consequences. So how do you get your diversity hat? How do you get one so you can see the world around you through different lenses? Observe. Pay attention to what's going on in the world. Think about what you see and question what you see and what you're told. I started getting my diversity hat as a very, very young girl. This is my great-great-grandmother, Laura Ratcliffe Lenore, and she was a slave. And she would tell my grandmother, who was her granddaughter, stories about her life as a slave. And my grandmother told me. And I remember being very, very troubled about the things that I heard. And I would wonder, well, why would somebody treat somebody differently just because of the color of their skin? Started getting my diversity hat. I also, in addition to my elementary school teacher saying, "Good morning, boys and girls," every day we had to say the Pledge of Allegiance. And every time when I got to the part where I said, "With liberty and justice for all," with my hand over my heart, I wondered why there had not been any liberty for black people for so many years in the United States. And I also wondered why still there was no justice for black people. We hear a lot about racial profiling now by the police. It was a problem many, many, many years ago. It didn't just start. I also wondered every time I sang the Star-Spangled Banner, and I got to the part about the land of the free, and I wondered, well, how could a country in which we talked about being the land of the free enslave people and continue the discrimination against them for many, many years? I wondered. I had on my diversity hat. I wondered when I began studying the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Well, I knew that all men had been created equal, but they weren't treated as though they were equal. And it actually took me a long time to even realize that it said all men are created equal and made invisible women. And this is a woman who had her diversity hat on her child at that point, and I still missed the fact that women were missing from the Declaration of Independence. So I was wondering. I wondered about slavery. I wondered about American Indians and how they were treated and banished to reservations. I wondered about the whites-only signs that were still prevalent in the South. I lived through the Civil Rights Movement, and I thought and I learned and I wondered during that period. And then I went to work and then began wondering and seeing some things there as well. And what I saw as HR issues in some of the organizations in which I worked were the effects of socialization on jobs that people got, the effects of stereotyping. Now, stereotyping is our way of making sense of a whole lot of information. And so we use surface level characteristics like sex and race to help us place people, and it makes it easy for us to deal with a lot of information. So we have boys and girls, and we know what we think about them. We have lazy, we have uneducated. We might have don't speak good English. We might have nurturing or good at math. And once we think these things about people, that winds up leading to certain jobs for certain people, other jobs for other people. Certain people don't get jobs. There's another HR-related concept called the similarity effect that's been documented by researchers. In one study I have cited here by Karen Goldberg, very interesting study. It's related to similarity effect. And what this is that we have groups that are our in-groups, who are people who are similar to us. And we like to hire and promote and reward people like us. As compared to out-groups, people like them, we don't like to hire and promote and reward people like them. And in this one particular study, this researcher found that whites engaged in the similarity effect and African Americans did not. And I wondered about that. I'm always wondering, well, why did this happen? Why did this happen? And I thought about something called internalized racism. And you all may be familiar with the research that happened in the late 1950s, but it's been talked about a whole lot by Kenneth and Mamie Clark, who were psychologists, and they looked at African American children and they gave them black dolls or white dolls and let them choose who they wanted to play with. Well, this research has been replicated very recently, and the same thing happens. The black children choose to play with the white dolls, and in the recent research, it's really, really troubling. The black children say, the black doll is the bad doll. Well, why is she the bad doll? Because she's black. Well, which one is like you? And the child reluctantly says, the black doll is like me. So there's something called internalized racism, which perhaps might make a difference. These photos here, you see me, the cute baby on the left with the baby doll. That was one of my first dolls, and my mother said my neighbor gave us that doll. These dolls on the right are my daughter's first dolls, trying to work with some of these things that I know exist in society. In fact, black people get the same messages that everybody gets about who's smart, who's not smart, who's good and who's not good, and that perhaps leads to some of the things we see. So when we put together diversity, social issues, and human resources, I've talked about access discrimination. That's when people are denied access to jobs. Treatment discrimination, that is when people get the jobs, but they're steered to girls' jobs or jobs that are appropriate to people like them, or don't get performance rewards or compensation rewards, or are laid off more. Or another aspect is unemployment, higher unemployment, and earnings disparities. And as I've said before, lots of researchers have studied this, thank goodness, and we find documented research that supports what I'm talking about. Gender discrimination. There's one fascinating study orchestrating impartiality, and what these researchers found was when the judges were blind to the sex of the person trying out for the orchestra, lo and behold, more women were selected. Another study that I have cited here was a low-wage field experiment in which these researchers sent a whole lot of black, Latino, and white young men to apply for actually advertised jobs in New York City. And New York City is diverse, and so you really might not expect that what they found they would found. What they found was white applicants were more likely to be called back for an interview or offered a job. And most troubling, what they found was black and Latino applicants with a clean record were no more likely to be called back from the employer, receive a positive response, than a white applicant who had just been released from prison. And this is really, really, really troubling. You also, if you're interested in this, and I hope that you are, you can go to eeoc.gov for actual cases that support many of these things that researchers have found in field studies with real organizations. So here's some U.S. Census Bureau data that I have to show you. And this shows some of the earnings consequences of discrimination and differential treatment. And so this is earnings for whites, Asians, Hispanics, and blacks who have a college degree. And you can see there's the mean and the median. And for both, whites earn the most on average and by median, followed by Asians, Hispanics, and blacks, college-educated folks. Same kind of pattern, except reverse for unemployment. Whites are least likely to be unemployed at 3.7%, those who have their college degrees. And there's a hierarchy. So in the middle, there's Asians, Hispanics, and blacks with the least to most likely to be unemployed. These are people who've done what they should do, studied, gone to college, and still more likely to be unemployed just by virtue of the color of their skin. So what are some recommendations I have for you? I encourage you to get and wear your diversity hat. I encourage you to observe what's going on around you in the world, and don't just listen to what somebody may tell you. Think about it for yourself and try to figure out, why is this going on? Don't be oblivious to what's going on. Remember socialization, stereotyping, the similarity effect, and their negative consequences. And I want to encourage you to focus on job-relevant information. If you are making decisions, hiring decisions, focus on job-relevant information rather than someone's name sounding Black or Latino or Asian. Focus on things that are related to whether or not this person can perform the job. I think education's really, really important, and I am a proponent of educating people early. I think students need to learn this in elementary school and high school. Everybody doesn't go to college, so they get to organizations and they're not aware of these things. I also think organizations need to have policies and control and monitoring to try to ensure these things don't happen. You have an HR group in your organization, you can look at the data. Look at the data, and that'll tell you what's going on in your organization. I saw this recently with my diversity hat on. Wheelchair accessible entrance available. Please ask inside for assistance. Now this is in a store, this is in a local store, and I was shopping with my husband, and I pulled out my cell phone to take a picture, and he just kind of shook his head like, Lord, there she goes again. Well, I can no longer remove the diversity hat from my head, so even when I'm shopping, I see things like this, and I wonder, well, so if you're using a wheelchair, you can't get in there to shop. So this negatively affects the organization because they're not able to sell to you. And you can't get in there to work, to apply for a job. And in fact, people with disabilities have very, very high unemployment rates, even when they're ready and willing and want to work. This is a social issue. There's so much more to do to eradicate racism, sexism, heterosexism. You may not know that in most states in the United States, you can be fired for being gay or for being perceived as gay. That's a social issue. There's ageism, where younger workers and older workers experience discrimination in employment. Stereotypes about younger workers: irresponsible, won't come to work on time, party all night. Older workers can't learn new technology, don't want to learn, gonna retire soon. These are social issues. There's also ableism. But then we get again to the but, my wondering. Get your diversity hat, wear it, observe, and work for change. I encourage you to do that. And then when we might ask if we could achieve with liberty and justice for all, could we truly be the land of the free? Might we be a place where all men and women are treated equally? And I would answer, yes, absolutely. Thank you very much.